Hi, my name is James Wood. I'm a former associate editor at First Things and incoming professor of ministry at Redeemer University in Ancaster, Ontario. I wrote my First Things essay to describe my personal journey from being a devoted disciple of Keller and his framework for cultural engagement to having some reservations about its fittingness for our contemporary moment. I also wanted to give voice to many who I know have experienced similar shifts, but at the same time to defend Keller against his harshest critics and to provide some constructive, concrete terms for the debate going forward. My goal was not to attack this great man or disregard his profound role that he played as a public Christian figure for decades. My desire, rather, was to explain what I see as some of the limitations and errors in his framework, primarily as it is applied by his massive band of disciples who populate various pastorates and other Christian leadership positions, and who regularly comment on contemporary issues through social media and other platforms. Tying it to Keller was simply the product of my own personal journey with his thought, but I'm actually much more interested in the framework and how it's perpetuated by those disciples today. In the piece, I used two terms to provide a catch-all umbrella label for the package approach to cultural engagement that Keller's most prominent disciples adopt: winsome third-wayism. And I'm not absolutely opposed to either term. There are biblical imperatives related to winsomeness that we can't ever abandon, and I'll discuss those in a moment. And at its best, third-wayism attempts to avoid tribalism and uncritical partisanship and to minimize divisions between Christians who come to different prudential calculations over political issues, albeit within the realm of moral orthodoxy. But what I refer to with this catch-all label is the package approach to cultural engagement that seeks above all to minimize offense so as to maximize openness to the gospel message. Too often, though, I argue, this translates into niceness, which I believe is a sentimentalized reduction of the biblical vision. And it ends up producing a few common effects in the adherents of the model. First, it leads Christians to embrace the narratives pushed by our cultural elites, many of whom are increasingly hostile to Christianity and its moral teachings, a development which I believe has exhibited acute acceleration in recent decades. Second, this leads Christians to scorn fellow believers, often to their right, who are more out of step with the cultural consensus. Christians who adopt this model are often quick to accept culture's views of Christians, to dump on those deemed fundamentalists, and to punch right when they are told. Joshua Mitchell describes this as innocent signaling, and those who do this enjoy what Carl Trueman calls progressive privilege. And thus they are more reticent to acknowledge the profound cultural shifts in recent years because they enjoy temporary protection from the left's cultural warriors as a result of engaging in ritual acts of Christian self-loathing, scapegoating Christians to their right, and focusing only on Christian moral teachings that comport with the contemporary status quo. 3, since culture has shifted so significantly, I argue, no matter how nicely Christians present traditional biblical positions on certain hot-button issues, they will be viewed as backwards and bigoted, as unloving and unwinsome. And this will lead them, I think, to doubt their convictions. Christians will be pressured to assume that loving the sinner means affirming and supporting their sin. In my essay, I tied all of this to Aaron Renn's 3 Worlds of American Evangelicalism article and his framework in that. In that article, he describes pretty acute shifts in the last decade dating to Obama's second term in which American society has become more outright opposed to traditional Christian conceptions of justice and social morality. One of my key arguments in the piece was that the winsome third-way model for cultural engagement was more suited to an earlier era and is less fitting for our context. My other main critique, besides how a shift in context demands a new approach to cultural engagement, is less context-specific. I argue that Keller and his disciples tend often to approach politics and cultural engagement on hot-button issues through the lens of evangelism and thus in an apologetic mode. This leads Christians, often and in various ways, to let the broader culture set the terms for our engagement out of fear about negative perception. And one of my main arguments that I developed further in a follow-up essay at American Reformer is that this approach is actually always incorrect, for at least 3 reasons. First, I don't believe we can be so certain how our political judgments and actions will be assessed by the broader public, especially some public in the future. For instance, on abortion and opposition to the pushing of trans ideology on children, future generations might plausibly look back and wonder how our age permitted these horrors and admire those who resisted the status quo and fought for the most vulnerable. And thus, they might be open to their message. Who knows? 2, other than that, I think that this way of approaching politics through the lens of evangelism is simply a category error. Politics is not about minimizing offense so as to maximize openness to the evangelistic message. Politics is rather focused on the pursuit of justice and the just ordering of society. 3. Lastly, this approach leads to all sorts of false moral equivalencies on issues and strategies, producing an almost crippling inability to recognize and publicly admit when there is a moral asymmetry between contemporary sides and even among the issues themselves. What then happens is adherents of this approach constantly highlight with equal airtime the flaws in each strategy or position. This then inhibits the capacity to act in accord with proper political prudence. Some causes, I argue, are simply more important than others, some issues are black and white, and some strategies are clearly more in accord with justice. There are 4 general angles from which my article has been critiqued. First, many take aim at Rheims' framework itself, and I don't really want to get bogged down on that issue too much, especially since I don't overly rely on it in my own thinking about these matters. In previous publications, I focused much more on stages and developments in post-Christian or post-Christendom societies. But I do think Wren has provided a service to put some language on pretty self-evident shifts in our culture's relationship to evangelicalism and Christian moral and social teachings in the past decades, providing a simple, helpful heuristic to describe a certain stage on the path to a more fully post-Christendom society, one which, he argues, has seen acute acceleration in the past decade. Just a couple examples to describe this. Not long ago, it really did seem like many Democrats wanted abortion to be rare.
We can support a woman's right to choose that makes abortion safe, legal, and rare, and reduces the number of abortions.
And one could even find pro-life Democrats in Congress. Now, any restriction on abortion is denounced as Christian nationalism. And on sex and gender issues, in 1996, Joe Biden voted in support of the Defense of Marriage Act.
I can't believe the American people can't see through this. We already have a law, the Defense of Marriage Act, where we've all voted, not where I voted and others said, look, marriage is between a man and a woman, and states must respect that.
And then in 2008, during his vice presidential run, he openly opposed same-sex marriage.
Senator, do you support gay marriage?
No.
Now he supports it, and now in 2022 as president, he's basically all in on the trans agenda. Some might say, well, this just focuses on sex and gender issues, but in matters of awareness of racial injustice, our society is moving closer to the biblical vision. I think this is incorrect. The civil rights movement explicitly appealed to Christian teachings on justice, and part of its success was due to the fact of a broad cultural consensus that the Bible's views on these issues mattered. But it seems now that Christians are adopting secular frameworks on these things. Another accusation is that my advocacy for a different approach, for a different context, signals that I'm succumbing to pragmatism. I think this is the least serious critique. And it's quite ironic coming from those devoted to Keller and his framework, because it is Keller himself who taught me more than anyone else about the importance of contextualization. I don't believe that he ever imagined or promoted his approach as the absolute, universal, final way to approach ministry and cultural engagement. Another charge I've seen is this: haven't we always been in negative world? Hasn't the church always faced opposition? What about the early church and the hostility it faced? Well, one of my presuppositions is that there is a difference between a pre-Christian and a post-Christian context. And I think we still need to do quite a bit more thinking about what this means. Keller has already provided some resources with his teachings on inoculation against Christian beliefs, as partial exposure to Christian teachings provides a certain defense against the real thing. My research on Henri de Lubac provided me some more resources to think through the particular challenges posed by post-Christian cultures. He explained how certain trends of thought, which he associated with a 12th century monk named Joachim, present a view of historical progress in which a stage emerges when a society believes it can move on from the particularities of Christianity, thus believing that it has progressed beyond them. In such a society, it's easy then to assume that Christianity has been fulfilled and replaced by secular human progress. Therefore, Christian social and moral ideals are left behind and they're viewed as backward. Alongside this, I believe a residual memory of Christian cultural dominance makes it easy to blame Christianity for our ongoing social ills. These all lead to a strong resistance to any attempt to promote moral norms for the social ordering. This neuters not just our witness, but also socio-political engagement for the common good. Our pursuit of justice and service of God and neighbor will be met with hostility that we won't be able to ultimately avoid. And I don't believe the winsome third way model prepares us sufficiently for political action in this context. A church obsessed with appearing winsome will be tempted to over-accommodate secular culture's negative propaganda against Christian moral teaching. This will fail our neighbors. Finally, some critics worry that I'm, quote, promoting cruelty and malice as instruments of political and cultural conflict, end quote, thus calling Christians to abandon civility and the biblical imperatives to love our neighbors, even our enemies, and the like. I absolutely want to dispel such concerns. No shift in context repeals these imperatives. But I think we need to think seriously through what loving our neighbor looks like in an increasingly post-Christian culture, in which there is mounting opposition to Christian ideals and profound moral confusion. I'm arguing that this context demands greater clarity, courage, and resilience. What I mean is that no matter how winsome you package it, our culture is going to hate the Bible's teachings on some of the most pressing issues of our day. So I want to conclude by quickly gesturing at what I think is needed in our context from two primary angles: politics and ministry. First, in regard to politics, I think we need to resist political pietism. The winsome third way approach often produces in its adherents a pietistic impulse to keep one's hands clean, to stay above the fray, and to reject imperfect options for addressing complex social and political issues. One of the figures who first helped me see through the limits of third wayism is Emmanuel Mounier, a mid-century French philosopher and man on the Christian left. He railed hard against the third wayism he saw in his day, saying it led to political fecklessness and foolishness. He referred to its adherents with the label paraplegics of virtue, because how they approached politics through a pietistic, moralistic lens, focusing too much on keeping their hands totally clean and ending up failing to do good for their neighbors. The view of politics I'm promoting here does not mean the ends justify the means. No, but I think we need to be clear about what the proper ends of political action are. Again, our political stances are not to be developed, articulated, and pursued primarily in view of minimizing offense so the gospel can be heard. The ends are justice and the temporal common good. As we become more clear about the proper ends of political action, then I think we also must think more clearly about the means available to us. And here I think we need a good dose of Christian realism. The apologetic mode of politics and forms of political pietism tend to cloud one's judgment as it pertains to determining prudential solutions to the complex problems of the temporal order. At times, for certain causes, Christians will need to collaborate with flawed figures and employ imperfect methods. Almost any successful political movement, including those for just causes, demands such. And in the negative world, to use Wren's phrase, Christians will find that they are disproportionately charged with mischief here. We need to be clear-sighted in our cultural and political battles. Christians need to know that yes, we love our enemies, but we do have enemies. Praying daily through the Psalms makes this abundantly clear. Yes, we pray for our enemies, but we admit that they exist. And related to this, we need in our political engagement, I propose, to retrieve a theology of the demonic. This is another limitation of the model I am critiquing. Third wayism often remains in the realm of ideas and worldviews. It tries to affirm the good in all sides and triangulate them by combining them somehow. My issue with this is that it doesn't sufficiently account for the spiritual and demonic realm. Some things are just evil, and there are wicked forces at play. So, we need to recognize the demonic, but with a clear caveat, without demonizing our political opponents. This is tricky and much more work needs to be done here. But some thoughts on ministry. As I said, winsomeness often translates into and reduces to niceness. But if you pay close attention to the biblical figures and just have some knowledge of church history, you know that saints and our Savior were not always nice. Faithful Christians have always been willing to offend their audiences with important truths. And this is especially the case with false teachers. The New Testament is clear. False teachers are to be marked, avoided, and rebuked. In fulfilling this vocation, Christian leaders need to stand firm in the face of charges that they are being too narrow-minded or unloving or combative. And in evangelism and discipleship, Christians must resist the temptation to hide hard truths that are in clear conflict with the dominant culture. If you mute some hard teachings to get people in the door, you increase the likelihood that you will mute them indefinitely. Because, as A.W. Tozer says, what you win people with is what you win them to. Ultimately, this will result in a failure to sufficiently form God's people. Don't nuance away the tension with the world on the hot-button issues of our day. Don't flee from the distinct places where Satan is attacking the truths of God. There's a quote often misattributed to Martin Luther, but is actually from a woman named Elizabeth Rundle Charles that captures this quite well. She says, "If I profess with the loudest voice and clearest exposition every portion of the truth of God, except precisely that little point which the world and the devil are at that moment attacking, then I am not confessing Christ, however boldly I may be professing Christ. Where the battle rages, the loyalty of the soldier is proved. And to be steady on all the battlefield besides is mere flight and disgrace to him if he flinches at that point." End quote. More positively, Christian leaders need to equip other Christians to have very difficult conversations, to be able to speak truth without breaking off relationships in their personal lives. And pastors need to faithfully and courageously perform church discipline. There are not only theological positions that are out of bounds, but also moral ones. A recent high-profile example of what I am advocating is when Archbishop Cordileone instructed Nancy Pelosi to abstain from Holy Communion due to her continued advocacy of abortion. We need to remember that, in the words of C.S. Lewis, the hardness of God is kinder than the softness of men. This might not only help to bring justice in our nation, but bring people like Pelosi to a place of repentance. Don't winsome your way into thinking that you are kinder than God. And I want to conclude with a word of hope. One of the other accusations leveled at my pieces is that people think I'm afraid.
As I read all these articles by Wood and Wren and Dreher, the thing you walk away with, how truly frightened these guys are.
No, I simply want Christians to be aware of the challenges they might likely face and to be prepared so that they are undeterred by them and support each other in them. But also, I'm inspired because I think that there are some unique evangelistic opportunities in our time. In a time of moral confusion and widespread nonsense that goes largely unchecked but is wreaking havoc on the social order and in the souls of men and women, Christians can be a voice of clarity, courage, and reason. Many are looking for answers, desperate for someone to say the same thing, to explain the good order to which we can and should conform. Christians, above all, can provide that voice. And I also want Christians to be confident in their legitimate political endeavors, to not let themselves be handicapped with the charges of culture warring and the like. I want to help us recognize the rhetorical manipulation that often hampers our actions for the common good. You see, when conservative Christians seek political influence, it's often described as culture war and politicizing Christianity. Whereas when progressive Christians do it, it's called prophetic witness and social justice. What I want to encourage Christians to do is simply embrace the framework and language of justice for the legitimate goods in the political realm that we seek. Yes, we'll continue to debate what justice is and how it is best achieved, but that is a more honest debate that we can have. So, love your neighbor, even your enemies, but recognize that there are enemies. Pursue justice, call evil evil, and don't let the world around you define what love looks like. Speak truth and stand firm.